Many of us have grown up hearing about God in church pews, under stained glass windows, and from the mouths of well-meaning preachers. But today, I want to challenge you, not to destroy faith, but to liberate it. Because there's a lie that's been told, passed from pulpit to pew, wrapped in tradition and fear, and it's time to confront it. The lie is this: that God is only found within the walls of a church, that access to the divine requires a middleman, that unless you follow a specific set of man-made rules, you are unworthy of love, grace, and salvation. Let me be clear, this lie is not always told maliciously. Many pastors believe what they preach. But the problem is not just in their sincerity, it's in the limitation they place on the infinite. God is not a denomination. God is not a ritual. God is not limited by Sunday morning or a clerical collar. Yet so often, the institutional church presents God as if he can be neatly packaged, controlled, and sold. We're told that questioning is dangerous, that doubt is weakness. But the truth is, faith without the freedom to question isn't faith at all. It's indoctrination. Too many churches have turned God into a gatekeeper instead of a guide, a judge instead of a healer, a figure of fear instead of a force of love. Let me tell you this: you are not separated from God, not by your past, not by your doubts, not by your absence from a church building. The divine lives in your breath, your conscience. What's been sold to many is a version of God that profits institutions but leaves souls hungry. People are taught to obey rather than understand, to follow blindly rather than connect deeply. But the real truth, God is bigger than doctrine, bigger than sermons, bigger than the walls of any building. And once you realize that, you reclaim your power. You realize that the voice of God may speak just as loudly in your solitude as in any sermon. That divine love isn't reserved for the religious elite, it's for all of us. So today, I'm not asking you to walk away from your faith. I'm asking you to wake up within it. Peel away the layers of fear and shame and rediscover the divine truth that's been within you all along. Because the greatest lie is not that God exists or doesn't exist, it's that you need someone else to tell you how to find him. You don't. You never did. You only need the courage to seek for yourself. Many have been led to believe that God can only be found in a building, during a service, or through a religious leader. But the truth is, God is everywhere. In nature, in silence, in love, in you. Limiting God to a location is a human construct, not a divine reality. This belief that God lives in church buildings and primarily shows up on Sundays is not just limiting, it's misleading. It creates a false division between the sacred and the ordinary, as though certain spaces are holy while the rest of life is secular and less meaningful. This view trains people to associate spiritual connection with rituals, robes, and rehearsed sermons, when in reality the divine presence is constantly surrounding and within us. Think about it. If God is truly all-powerful, all-knowing, and ever-present, as so many religious teachings claim, how could he be confined to one place? How could he require a building, an altar, a microphone, or a dress code to show up? The moment we claim that God only dwells in churches, we reduce the infinite to something small, manageable, and controlled. But God is not manageable. God is not confined by walls or rules or hours of operation. This idea that the sacred only happens in churches gives the impression that God is distant and selective, that his presence only becomes available through scheduled gatherings or the hands of clergy. That idea is both disempowering and damaging. It causes people to believe they must wait for someone else to lead them to God. It makes them feel unworthy unless they follow specific traditions or attend weekly services. But that was never the original intention of the divine. Look at the natural world, the way the sun rises without permission, how the waves move in perfect rhythm, how birds sing their songs without a choir leader. That is God. God is the creative force in all living things, not just in sermons and ceremonies. The wind carries God's voice. The stars reflect God's mystery. A newborn's cry, a genuine act of kindness, a moment of peace in your soul. These are all sacred. These are all divine. And none of them require pews or pulpits. There's nothing inherently wrong with church buildings. Many offer community, reflection, and teachings that uplift people's lives. But the problem begins when people believe that church is the only place where God is active, when people stop seeing the holy in everyday moments, when people start measuring their worth based on church attendance instead of their inner connection with the divine. This mindset also opens the door to control. If a church convinces you that God only speaks through its ministers, then your spirituality becomes dependent on that institution. You begin to feel that your relationship with the divine is conditional, based on your behavior, your tithe, your submission to rules. But the truth is, God doesn't live in the building, God lives in you. Jesus himself challenged religious structures. He spoke to people in fields, on mountainsides, in streets, anywhere people were open to truth. He didn't wait until they entered a synagogue to heal them. He didn't require a stage or a pulpit. His message was simple and powerful. The kingdom of God is within you. That was a radical statement then, and it still is today. Because if God is within you, then your worth isn't decided by any religious institution. Your access to God is not a membership benefit. It's your birthright. So what happens when people realize this? What happens when someone steps outside a church building and starts to experience the sacred in their own heart, in a walk through the woods, in silence on their bedroom floor, in the laughter of their children? They start to realize that they were never far from God at all. They start to unlearn the fear that was preached into them. They begin to trust their intuitions, their conscience, and their experience of love as valid ways to connect with the divine. And that scares some institutions, because if people truly understood that God is not limited to a location, they might stop relying on the church for spiritual authority. They might start to walk in freedom. They might begin to love more deeply, forgive more easily, and question more boldly. And when that happens, religion shifts from being about control to being about connection. You don't need a stained glass window to feel close to God. You don't need a preacher to tell you when you're worthy. You don't need a specific building to make your prayers count. You only need to be willing to listen to yourself, to life, to the still, small voice that speaks in moments of peace and clarity. The real tragedy is not that people are leaving church buildings, it's that so many still believe they're leaving God behind when they do. But they're not. You're not. You were never outside of God's presence to begin with. The walls were never required, the labels were never necessary, and the truth is God has never been far. He has always been with you, wherever you are. You don't need a middleman to reach God. Churches often present themselves as the exclusive bridge between you and God. But the truth is, your connection to the divine is direct. No priest, pastor, or preacher owns your spiritual access. You are worthy of relationship with God without mediation. For centuries, religious institutions have built systems where certain individuals are elevated as spiritual gatekeepers. These leaders, dressed in robes, standing behind altars or pulpits, are often seen as closer to God, more qualified to speak on behalf of the divine. But this belief system subtly and sometimes blatantly teaches that the average person is not holy enough, pure enough, or informed enough to stand before God on their own. This has created a dangerous dynamic. It teaches people to feel small, dependent, even fearful. It plants the idea that they must earn their access to God through someone else's blessing, approval, or interpretation. But that's not the message of divine love. That's the message of religious hierarchy. Look throughout spiritual history, across scriptures, across cultures, and you'll see something powerful. The individuals who encountered God most profoundly were not always priests or scholars. They were shepherds, exiles, poets, broken men and women, ordinary people who turned their hearts towards something greater. What they had in common was not religious title, but sincere openness. They sought connection, not control. And this is where so many churches get it wrong. They claim to offer spiritual guidance, but instead, many have built spiritual dependency. They don't just point people toward God, they position themselves as the required path to Him. This isn't just misguided, it's manipulation. When you believe that someone else is more qualified to access God than you are, you surrender your power. You become a follower of people rather than a follower of truth. You wait for sermons to tell you who you are. You look to rituals and ceremonies to give you what you already carry within. But here is the truth that can change everything. You are already connected to the source. You were born with access. There is no mediator required for your soul to speak to the divine. There is no spiritual hotline that goes through a human switchboard. Your prayers do not need translation. Your pain does not need permission to be healed. The divine hears you, sees you, knows you directly. The idea that you need someone else to bless your relationship with God is an illusion that serves institutions, not individuals. It keeps the power outside of you instead of awakening it within you. It encourages performance over authenticity. It replaces inner awareness with external approval. But the moment you realize that your spirit is sacred, that your voice matters, that your questions and experiences are valid, you take back what was never supposed to be given away. Some might argue that spiritual leaders are necessary to interpret Scripture or maintain moral order, and yes, teachers can be helpful, guidance can be a gift. But guidance is not ownership. Leadership should never turn into control. Teaching should never become a substitute for direct experience. At its best, a spiritual leader points you back to yourself, not to them. You were not created to be spiritually dependent. You were created to be spiritually free, and true freedom means understanding that your connection to God is personal, present, and powerful, no matter where you are. There is something deeply sacred about realizing that no one can come between you and the divine. Not your past, not your failures, not your doubt, not your lack of formal religious education. Nothing disqualifies you from a relationship with God because that relationship was never based on qualifications in the first place. It was based on love. When you finally see this, religion no longer becomes something you consume, it becomes something you live. You stop chasing approval and start embracing authenticity. You stop outsourcing your spiritual life and start listening to your own soul. That doesn't mean you reject community or that all churches are bad. It means you stop confusing the building for the source, the leader for the truth, the ritual for the relationship. You can learn from others, but you are never beneath them. You can pray in a group, but your solitary prayers are just as powerful. You can listen to sermons, but your quiet reflections are just as holy. You are not less than the preacher. You are not less than the priest. You are not less than the pastor. Your spirit carries the same divine spark. Your connection to God does not require an interpreter. So if you've ever felt like you weren't worthy to speak to God directly, let that belief fall away. If you've ever felt like your prayers only count when someone else says amen over them, know that God hears you before you even speak. And if you've been taught that someone else holds the keys to your salvation, remember that those keys were never outside of you. They've always been in your own hands. Questioning is not a sin, it's a sign of growth. The idea that you must never question Scripture or church teaching is a control tactic. Real faith isn't afraid of hard questions. In fact, God invites your curiosity, your doubts, and your search for truth. Blind obedience is not spirituality, it's submission. From a young age, many people are taught to equate obedience with holiness. Don't question the Bible. Don't question the pastor. Don't question what we believe. These are the messages subtly or sometimes directly hammered into our minds. And what's the result? We become silent. We suppress doubts. We pretend to believe what we're told, even when something deep inside us is wrestling with it. But why is questioning treated like rebellion? Why is doubt seen as a weakness when in reality it can be the beginning of deeper understanding? The truth is, when a system fears your questions, it's because it doesn't trust its own answers. Control thrives on silence, not conversation. But true faith is not threatened by your curiosity, it is strengthened by it. When you ask questions, you're not turning away from God, you're turning toward truth. You're saying, I care enough about this to dig deeper. You're not trying to destroy faith, you're trying to make it real. There is something deeply sacred in that search. It's honest, it's personal, it's alive. Look at the great spiritual figures throughout history, people who shaped the faiths we follow today. They were not silent followers. They were wrestlers, seekers, challengers of tradition. Jesus himself questioned the religious authorities of his day. He broke rules. He called out hypocrisy. He said things that made people uncomfortable, things that upset the religious elite. Why? Because truth doesn't always fit into the boxes we build for it. In the Hebrew scriptures, Jacob wrestled with God all night. He left the encounter with a limp, but also with a blessing. That's what happens when we engage honestly with the divine. We may leave with more scars than simple answers, but we come away changed. We come away real. The church, unfortunately, has too often tried to sanitize faith. It wants it clean, controllable, and quiet. It wants certainty, not struggle. But a faith that refuses to make space for doubt is not strong. It's brittle. It breaks under pressure. And that's what so many people experience. They ask hard questions about doctrine, about the Bible, about suffering, about injustice. And instead of being met with humility, they're met with shame. Don't question God, they're told, but what if questioning is how we come to know God more intimately? What if it's not a threat to faith, but the very path to it? There's a difference between questioning out of arrogance and questioning out of hunger. The first is driven by ego, the second is driven by longing, and God welcomes longing. God meets us in the mystery. God is not afraid of our whys, our hows, our cries for understanding. But religious systems often are, because once you start asking questions, you might realize that some of the things you were taught to believe are based more on human tradition than divine truth. You might see the cracks in the institution. You might begin to think for yourself, and that's dangerous to any system built on unquestioning loyalty. That's why you're often told that faith and doubt are enemies, but they're not. They're partners. Doubt pushes us forward. It leads us to refine our beliefs, to shed what no longer fits, and to hold on more tightly to what really matters. A faith that has never been tested, questioned, or challenged might be easy, but it's not deep. Some of the most transformative spiritual moments come not in certainty, but in crisis. In the nights when you feel alone, in the days when the old answers don't satisfy, in the tension between what you've been told and what you're actually experiencing. These moments are not failures, they are invitations. They are doorways into a more honest, mature, and intimate relationship with the divine. Real spirituality is not about pretending to have it all figured out. It's about learning how to live with mystery, how to stay open when the path isn't clear, and how to love truth more than tradition. If your church or any person tells you that your questions make you a bad believer, remember this: Jesus chose doubters. Prophets argued with God. Psalms are filled with confusion and lament. The Bible itself is a collection of voices, often in conversation and sometimes in contradiction with each other. That's not a flaw. That's the point. Faith is not a monologue. It's a dialogue. It's not a script you recite. It's a story you live. So ask your questions, all of them, the big ones, the uncomfortable ones, the ones you're scared to say out loud. You don't need to fear losing your faith if you do. What you might lose is your illusion of certainty. And in its place, you may find something deeper, a faith that breathes, bends, and grows with you. Because faith that cannot be questioned is not faith, it's control. And control is not the voice of God. God speaks through wonder, through wrestling, through silence and storm alike. He meets you where you are, not where someone else tells you to be. God is not a punisher waiting for you to slip up. The image of a wrathful God watching your every move, ready to condemn you, is fear-based theology. God is love, not a trap. Grace, compassion, and mercy are the true nature of the divine, not constant judgment. For too long, many of us have been taught to see God as a stern authority figure in the sky, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, keeping a record of every mistake we make. The God of this version watches silently from a distance, just waiting for the moment we break a rule so he can deliver the punishment we supposedly deserve. And as a result, people walk through life burdened by guilt, paralyzed by shame, and terrified of failing. This is not love. This is not freedom. This is spiritual fear-mongering. This view of God as some cosmic enforcer does not come from divine truth. It comes from human systems of control. When people are afraid of punishment, they become more obedient to authority. They stay in line. They don't question. They don't think for themselves. That kind of fear-based obedience benefits religion as an institution, but it damages the human soul. True love does not monitor for failure. True love doesn't threaten or shame or manipulate. And if God is love, as nearly every faith claims, then God cannot also be the kind of presence that keeps you small through fear. What's tragic is how many people have walked away from faith not because they lost belief in something sacred, but because they were crushed under the weight of a theology that painted God as more judge than healer. They were told that God's default posture was disappointment, that their doubts, desires, or humanity made them unworthy, that unless they were perfect, they were deserving of eternal punishment. How is that supposed to inspire transformation? How can a person grow when they're told their flaws make them evil? Let me tell you this clearly. You are not your mistakes. You are not defined by your weakest moment. God is not hunting you down for every failure. He is running toward you with grace. God does not rejoice in your brokenness. He moves with compassion to meet you in it. Think of the way a loving parent responds to a child who stumbles, not with rage, but with care. Not with rejection, but with patience. That is the kind of love that heals. That is the kind of love that transforms. And that is the kind of love the divine extends to every one of us, not because we've earned it, but because it is who God is. The fear of punishment may create temporary compliance, but it never creates lasting change. Fear keeps people stuck. Love sets people free. If someone has to scare you into believing, then they're not pointing you to God, they're pointing you to a system of control. When you internalize the image of a punitive God, it affects how you see yourself and others. You start to judge people harshly. You begin to divide the world into the worthy and the unworthy. You begin to feel like love has to be earned, and therefore, so does grace. That's not spiritual growth. That's performance-based religion, and it turns relationship into pressure. But here's the truth that many churches forget to teach. God is not a transaction. God is not love in exchange for obedience. God is love, period. And that love does not disappear when you make a mistake. It doesn't disappear when you ask hard questions or walk away for a while, or even when you get angry at him. God is secure enough to handle your humanity. In fact, God works through our humanity, not in spite of it. He meets us in the mess, in the confusion, in the places where we've been made to feel least worthy. That's the entire point of grace. It's not deserved, but it's given anyway. It is not earned through good behavior. It is received through honest connection. When you let go of the image of God as a punisher, what you find is a presence of deep compassion. Not a cold observer, but an intimate companion. Not someone keeping score, but someone keeping you close. This shift in understanding doesn't make God smaller. It makes him real. It makes spirituality less about fear and more about freedom. Less about avoiding hell and more about living fully. You begin to live from a place of trust instead of tension. You stop hiding, you start healing. So many people carry spiritual wounds not because God failed them, but because religion misrepresented him. They were given fear instead of faith, rules instead of relationship, judgment instead of joy. But if you are willing to unlearn the lie that God is waiting for you to mess up, you can begin to experience something sacred, the steady, relentless kindness of the divine, a love that walks with you in failure, a grace that doesn't flinch at your doubts, a mercy that never runs out. This is not the God of fear-based theology. This is the God who sees every part of you and still chooses love, who doesn't punish your humanity but redeems it, who doesn't wait with condemnation but moves toward you, arms open every time you fall. And that is not weakness. That is not compromise. That is what makes God holy. That is what makes grace amazing. Religious systems often serve themselves first. Many churches have built systems that protect power, money, and control, often at the cost of truth and spiritual freedom. The institution of church is not always the same as the intention of God. Be aware of the difference between spiritual guidance and manipulation. This is not an attack on faith. It's an honest confrontation with what happens when man-made systems claim divine authority and begin to place themselves above the people they are meant to serve. It happens quietly, subtly, and sometimes with good intentions. But the consequences are real. Power gets concentrated at the top. Questions are discouraged. Obedience is praised more than wisdom. And slowly, the spiritual journey turns into an institutional agenda. It's important to say this clearly. Not every church is corrupt, and not every leader is self-serving. There are many communities doing beautiful, humble, and authentic work. But when the institution becomes more concerned with its preservation than its purpose, it begins to drift far from what it was meant to be. It stops pointing people to God and starts pulling people into loyalty to itself. We see this in churches that silence victims to protect their reputations. We see it in leaders who preach generosity while living in extreme excess. We see it in the way certain groups are excluded, judged, or condemned, not because of love, but because of institutional tradition or social bias. The moment a church is more focused on its image than on its integrity, it stops being a place of healing and becomes a machine of control. The focus shifts from people to policy, from compassion to conformity, from presence to performance. And what's worse is that these systems often hide behind Scripture to justify their actions. They cherry-pick verses, distort meaning, and use guilt to keep people in line. But that's not God. That's not divine love. That's not what faith was ever meant to become. The early teachings of spirituality across many traditions point to a relationship with something greater than us. They emphasize humility, justice, mercy, and love. The prophets didn't serve temples. They confronted them. The great teachers didn't seek titles. They gave up power to walk among the people. The original spiritual message was never about building empires. It was about transforming hearts. And yet, somewhere along the way, that message got monetized. Organized religion in many places became more about institutional survival than soul revival. It became more about structures than spirit. Buildings got bigger while hearts grew smaller. Sermons became performances. Leaders became celebrities, and the people who dared to speak out were branded as rebellious or faithless. But questioning the system is not faithlessness, it's faith in action. It's the refusal to settle for a version of God filtered through ego, greed, and control. It's the courage to believe that God is not limited to a corporate structure or a religious brand. It's the insistence that truth matters more than tradition and that love matters more than loyalty to any institution. When people begin to wake up to this, something powerful happens. They start to reclaim their own spiritual authority. They begin to listen not just to sermons, but to their own inner knowing. They begin to realize that obedience is not the same as faithfulness, and that sometimes the most faithful thing you can do is walk away from a system that no longer reflects the heart of God. And that's a hard choice, because institutions will tell you that leaving them means leaving God, but they are not the same. The church was never supposed to replace the divine. It was supposed to reflect it. And when that reflection is distorted, people suffer, not just emotionally, but spiritually. They begin to feel unworthy, ashamed, confused. They feel spiritually hungry in places meant to feed them. They begin to see the cracks between the message and the motive. That's when the real journey begins. The journey of separating institutional religion from personal connection with God. The journey of unlearning the fear, the shame, and the rules that were more about control than about truth. The journey of realizing that you are still loved, still worthy, and still seen by God, even outside the systems that once told you otherwise. And that's what makes spiritual freedom so dangerous to religious systems. When people stop being afraid, they stop being easy to manipulate. When they stop needing approval, they stop being controlled. And when they start walking with God on their own terms, they become impossible to own. That's not rebellion. That's restoration. That's what faith looks like when it's no longer tangled in power games and profit margins. So yes, we can be thankful for spiritual community, for teaching, for tradition, but only when those things serve the soul, not suppress it. Only when they invite growth, not demand silence. Only when they reflect the open-hearted grace of the divine, not the closed doors of a self-serving institution. The truth is, God is not fragile. Truth does not need to be protected by hierarchy, and love does not depend on loyalty to an organization. If a church must use fear to keep you, it has already lost its way. Remember, God's intention has always been connection, not control. So if a system demands your silence, your submission, or your self-worth in exchange for belonging, walk away with your soul intact. Because no matter what you've been told, you don't need a system to access the sacred. God is not hidden behind stained glass or locked behind doctrinal gates. The divine lives in you, free, whole, and waiting to be rediscovered on your own terms. God lives within you. One of the most radical, often overlooked truths is that God is within. You don't have to chase God. You only have to be still and listen. Churches may teach dependency on them, but the real power lies in recognizing your own divine connection. This truth changes everything. For so long, people have been conditioned to believe that God is somewhere out there, distant, above, beyond, that to reach him you have to go through rituals, buildings, and spiritual authorities. You're told to seek, to strive, to pursue, as though God is always just out of reach, always requiring more from you before you're worthy of his presence. But what if that's not true? What if the very presence of the divine has been closer to you than you've ever been told? Not waiting in the clouds, not locked inside a holy place, not reserved for the spiritually elite, but alive, here and now, inside your own being. When you begin to grasp that God lives within you, you stop chasing something external and begin reconnecting with what's always been inside. You stop measuring your worth by how often you attend a service, how perfectly you perform your beliefs, or how closely you align with a religious institution. You begin to understand that your body is sacred, your mind is sacred, your soul is sacred, not because a church says so, but because God already chose to dwell there. This is a truth that threatens systems built on dependence, because if you realize that the Spirit of God is within you, you might stop giving blind loyalty to the people or places that convinced you otherwise. You might stop thinking you need to be fixed and start trusting that you're already loved. You might stop striving for divine approval and begin to live from divine connection. There is a quiet power in being still and listening, not to a preacher, not to a performance, but to your own soul. That space inside you where intuition, peace, and deep truth reside is where the divine whispers. But most people are never taught to trust that place. They're told it's dangerous, that it leads to error, that their heart is deceitful and unworthy. But this fear-based teaching doesn't come from God. It comes from those who need control more than they desire your freedom. You've been told that God only speaks through the scriptures, through pastors, through traditions. But look back at the sacred stories across time. How often did God speak directly to the heart of a person? A boy in a field, a woman at a well, a shepherd, a prophet, a rebel. They weren't the most educated or the most powerful, but they were listening. And because they listened, they encountered something holy, not outside, but within. To say that God lives within you is not arrogance, it's humility. It means you acknowledge that you are more than flesh and bone, that there is something eternal and divine at your core, that you are never truly alone because the sacred dwells within the very depths of your being. This doesn't mean you never doubt. It doesn't mean you never fall. It means that even in your most human moments, the presence of God is still with you, within you. Not disappointed, not distant, but present and patient. And once you realize this, the way you see yourself begins to shift. You begin to speak to yourself with more compassion. You begin to trust your inner wisdom. You begin to live with less fear and more purpose. You become less dependent on external validation and more rooted in inner truth. That's not to say there's no value in spiritual community. We all need each other. We all grow from being heard, seen, and challenged. But community is not meant to replace your direct connection with God. It's meant to support it. A healthy spiritual path encourages you to go inward, not just outward. It reminds you that you don't need someone else to authorize your relationship with the sacred. This is why silence is so powerful. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of stillness. When you quiet the noise of the world, its expectations, its judgments, its distractions, you start to hear a different voice, a voice that doesn't shout but speaks clearly, a voice that calls you beloved, not broken, a voice that knows who you are beneath the masks and fears. The divine within you doesn't demand perfection. It offers presence. It doesn't force you to perform. It invites you to be real. This isn't a God who's keeping score. It's a God who keeps showing up in every breath, every moment, every heartbeat. When you begin to live from this awareness, your life changes. You stop seeking God as a destination and start recognizing God as the companion in your journey. You stop fearing the sacred and start welcoming it into your daily life, not just in prayer, but in your work, your relationships, your creativity, your rest. And maybe that's the most radical truth of all, not that God exists, but that God exists within you. Not that you have to earn the right to know the sacred, but that you've been carrying it all along. You are not empty. You are not disconnected. You are not spiritually lost. You are the temple. You are the dwelling place. You are the space where heaven and earth meet, not because someone else said so, but because God already chose you as home. And the moment you stop searching outside and begin turning inward, you'll find the presence that was never gone, the voice that never stopped speaking, and the love that has never let go.